Hi guys, welcome to part 1 of your Ecology unit PowerPoint. So we're going to get started right away just by touching on a little bit more about biomes. So in general, biomes are classified according to 3 things. So their temperature, precipitation, and plant species. And just in case you need a better understanding of the word climate, climate is simply the average weather, which is the temperature and precipitation of a biome. So now we're going to get into organisms and their relationships. So first of all, you need to understand that the term ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms and their environment. So the largest part of this is biosphere. So this is the thin layer around the Earth, and it extends above the Earth's surface and below the ocean surface. There's 2 types of factors that we look at when we look at an ecosystem. So we're looking at biotic or living factors and abiotic or non-living factors. So as you can imagine, biotic factors, things like plant interactions and animal interactions, and abiotic factors are things like sunlight, temperature, rainfall, and other weather events. So here are the levels of organization. So as the numbers and interactions between organisms increase, the levels increase in complexity as well. So an organism or an individual is the smallest, and then a population is a group of organisms. A community is a group of populations. An ecosystem is a group of populations and those non-living factors. And then the biome is everything that shares a similar climate, and then the biosphere is simply the entire inhabitable part of the Earth. Here's those once again in definition form, so you may want to pause this and just double check your definitions for this theme. So there's also 2 types of ecosystem interactions that we need to talk about. So a habitat and a niche. So these are very commonly confused terms. The habitat is in general where an organism lives. The niche, on the other hand, is the role that that organism has in its environment. So if we take a look at this picture down here, you'll see that flamingos are in the deepest water, but then you have plovers that are all the way up on the shore. They all live on the seashore in that general area, but they all inhabit different parts of the shore, and as a result, they really don't compete with each other because they're eating different things and they're in different locations. 2 other common community interactions that we'll discuss are competition versus predation. So competition is just when more than one organism is using a resource at the same time. And this can be between individuals of the same species or between different species. Predation, on the other hand, is when one species gets its food from eating another species. So there are also some tips that animals can use to avoid predation. So there's camouflage in general. This is very common in prey species. They want to camouflage themselves, that way they don't get eaten by predators. There's also 2 types of mimicry that we're going to talk about. So Batesian mimicry is when one species mimics another undesirable species, which you see up here. So the scarlet king snake is non-venomous, but it looks an awful lot like an eastern coral snake, which is venomous. So to animals that are trying to eat the snake, they're really not even going to try because it looks too much like something that does have venom. In Müllerian mimicry, 2 undesirable species in the same community mimic each other. So if you look here at these wasps, they're both capable of stinging, causing harm, and they all kind of have the same coloring and other features that make them look the same. So there's also symbiotic relationships. So symbiosis in general is just a close relationship between 2 species that live together. But there are 3 specific types that we're going to discuss. So in mutualism, both species benefit, so they're both happy. In commensalism, one species is going to benefit, but the other has no benefit. It's not harmed, it's not helped, it's just there. And then in parasitism, one is benefited and one is harmed. Important to note here, in parasitism, the parasites don't want to kill their host because then they lose their food source. Now we're going to talk about the energy flow within an ecosystem. So producer and consumers are 2 common terms you should have heard of. Also autotroph versus heterotroph. So an autotroph, auto meaning self, these are animals that make their own food, or they feed themselves by using energy from the sun and other substances to produce food. Heterotrophs are things like us. We get our energy from consuming other organisms. There's also different types of heterotrophs. So we have herbivores, which eat plants, carnivores, which eat meat, omnivores that eat both, and something called a detritivore, which eats decomposing plant, animal, and fecal matter. So these are things like woodlice, slugs, and sea cucumbers and fiddler crabs, actually. There's also some models of energy flow that we need to discuss. So a food chain is the most simple model that shows the energy flow of an ecosystem. It typically moves from a producer to an herbivore, to an omnivore, to a carnivore, and sometimes there's even an additional larger carnivore at the end of that food chain. In a food web, we have many interconnected food chains, and they show all these different pathways of energy flow, which we'll look at in just a minute. And finally, the energy pyramid is a diagram which shows the amount of energy, the biomass, or the number of organisms that are at each trophic level. It's basically a food chain put into a pyramid. So trophic level then is a term that is just representing each step in that food chain or pyramid. So your first level is your bottom level, and these are your producers. Your second level is your primary consumers. Third level secondary consumers are those omnivores we talked about, and fourth level is your tertiary consumers or your carnivores. So here's an example of several food chains, and these are actually linked by biome. So if you look over here, it shows the trophic levels. So we have primary producer, consumers, and this one also talks about quaternary consumers. So those are those top predators that are very large and they eat the lower predators. Food webs then are interconnected food chains. So if you look here, for example, these leaves are going to two different species, which could result in two different food chains. Same thing, our frog gets eaten by the owl and the snake. An energy pyramid then is, like we talked about, just the food chain, and it shows the amount of biomass and what's available at each level. So if you notice, as we go up the pyramid, the biomass is decreasing. That's because as you move up, less and less is able to be supported at the top of the food pyramid. There's also something you need to know called the 10% rule. So as you move up the food pyramid, 90% of that available energy from that first level or bottom level below it is lost. So only 10% of energy is transferred up each level. And this is why simply there aren't many top predators, but there's lots of producers. So take a minute and pause this and look at this chart, and you'll see that it's powers of 10 as we go up that is lost, and it's lost in the form of heat energy through waste, dead matter, and then it goes to decomposers. Those are actually very important components of a food web and a food chain. The final thing we're going to talk about in these notes is the cycling of matter. So there are many cycles in the biosphere, but there's only a fixed amount of matter. So there's nothing new ever being formed. It's just transformed into usable forms throughout these cycles to support the ecosystem they need to. And it also involves living organisms and physical processes. So the four major cycles we'll discuss are the carbon-oxygen cycle, or I simply usually just call it the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. In the carbon-oxygen cycle, here's a picture of this. You may want to pause this and screenshot this or print this picture out. This will help you in your notes. There's two major processes in this cycle. So photosynthesis, which we know is something that plants do. They produce oxygen, but they take in carbon dioxide. And then cell respiration, which is what we do. We produce carbon dioxide, but we take in oxygen. So there's four major compounds in this cycle. You have water, carbon dioxide, glucose, and oxygen, and these are constantly cycling with each other. So the plants, like we talked about, they consume water, carbon dioxide, they produce sugar or in the form of glucose and oxygen. Animals do the opposite, and this is constantly cycling during this cycle. So when plants take up carbon dioxide, this is how they complete photosynthesis. So they do it for two reasons in terms of the cycle, the oxygen, but it's also food for those primary consumers. So this is then returned to the atmosphere in the form of CO2 after those consumers breathe it or eat it. Plant food contains the carbon, though, which is passed through the trophic pyramid. Something else you need to know is decomposers have a very important role in this cycle. So once they die, they're going to cycle, once organisms die, the decomposers cycle all the nutrients back into the ground. So the ones that died a long time ago are buried under sediments, constantly buried, and they're eventually pressurized into fossil fuels. So examples of fossil fuels that we burn include things like coal. So when our cars consume fossil fuels, we release that carbon dioxide, which is then going back into the cycle. Now, this also causes human impact issues because, as I'm sure you're aware, we release an excess amount of carbon dioxide, which is causing issues with global warming. The next cycle we're going to talk about is the water cycle. So this should be pretty familiar to you, and hopefully you know this, but there is a limited amount of water on Earth. This cycle is constant, so there's no definite start or end point. So here's another picture to help you out. Once again, pause this, screenshot it, or draw it, or print it out, so that way you have it for your notes. So these are the major stages of the water cycle. So we have evaporation, which is simply liquid to gas. This is moving from the ground or water into the atmosphere. We have condensation, which is when water vapor goes to liquid droplets in the air. This results in clouds and fog. We then have precipitation, which is when that condensed water vapor is falling back to the ground. This is things like rain, snow, hail, and sleet. We also have transpiration. This is probably one of the new terms for you, and this is the release of water vapor from plants and soil into the air. There's also accumulation, which is ponds, lakes, and groundwater, where that precipitation sits after it rains. And then there's runoff, which is the way the water moves across the land. This can go into the ground, can evaporate, it can get stored in lakes, or it can be extracted by humans. The third cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. So I don't know if you knew this, but 79% of the air is nitrogen, but we can't breathe it. We can't use it. It just goes in and out of our bodies. It doesn't do anything for us. But animals do need nitrogen, so we rely on a process called nitrogen fixation. So this is the process of making nitrogen usable for our bodies. So here's your nitrogen cycle diagram. Once again, pause and copy this down or screenshot it to print later. So nitrogen fixation, we want to make it usable for us. So there's 3 ways this happens: lightning, nitrogen fixing bacteria, which is the most common form, and then human factories can do it as well. So those bacteria are special species of bacteria that can change nitrogen into usable forms. So plants actually contain this bacteria in their roots. So legumes, clover, alfalfa, they all have this bacteria in their roots. So they're really important to this nitrogen cycle and making it usable for other organisms. So how does this cycle even work? Well, first, nitrogen fixation has to occur. From there, the plants are going to use the nitrogen, and then heterotrophs eat the plant, or other animals eat an animal that ate a plant. And then eventually, at the end of that animal's life cycle, or the plant's, the decomposers are going to break it down, and then they release nitrogen gas, which is the original form of nitrogen. So this breakdown of decomposers does something called denitrification, which puts it back into the atmosphere. The final cycle is the phosphorus cycle. So this is a cycle that really doesn't involve organisms so much. It involves a lot of rock. So once again, pause here and copy down or screenshot this picture for later. So like I said, the cycle mainly takes place in rocks. So rain's going to fall on rocks, and there's either runoff or it goes into the soil, and it causes phosphates to break off. As the rocks break off, there's phosphates. So these travel into the soil and they're consumed by plants. So there's inorganic phosphates and organic phosphates. So the plants take up the inorganic phosphates, but now the plants have phosphates, so they become an organic phosphate source. Then animals are going to eat the plants, or just like the nitrogen cycle, an animal eats an animal that ate the plants, and that's how they get their phosphorus. But when this animal dies, once again, detritivores are important because they turn those organic phosphates back into inorganic phosphates in the soil. And that is all for your notes.